Now at our nation's capital. If you're just now joining us, my name is Augustine, and right now I am joined with the Assistant Professor of Politics at Princeton University, Omar Wasow. He's studied race and politics for the last 15 years. Omar, thank you so much for joining us. It's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Omar, a lot of your research points towards how protests influence politics. So when you evaluate the events that took place at our nation's capital, what is your most significant takeaway?
One of the key things I look at in my research is what kinds of protest tactics are effective. And in particular, I look at the civil rights movement and look at moments where more nonviolent demonstrations were the tactic of choice, or where there was some violence employed by protesters in those demonstrations. And what I find is that often there's a kind of backlash effect against protests that include violence. And I think what we're seeing now, looking back to January 6th, is a similar kind of reaction where people are sort of all of the people watching might say, you know, there is a First Amendment right to peaceably assemble, and when we support that. But when demonstrations escalate to violence, then there's a sense of no, norms are being violated. This breaks our sense of what is appropriate and legal. And so even though these protesters felt like they were in the right, doing something that was, maybe the Boston Tea Party, or they kept invoking 1776, this is a revolution, in practice, what we're seeing is that it's created a significant negative, both, in terms of polling for President Trump, but also for the movement itself. The reaction from the general public seems to have been very negative.
Now, what do you think the impact could have been if the protests were nonviolent?
So as I understand it, the Stop the Steal movement and these other kind of related movements were trying to do was to essentially keep President Trump in office. And the core logic of that is built on a set of assumptions about an unfair election, but everyone from President Trump's Attorney General, Bill Barr, to Republican election officials, to Republican governors, to judges, more than 60 court cases, many of the judges appointed by Republicans and Trump. Across the board, what we've seen is that there just isn't any evidence of fraud, that this was a free and fair election. And so had there been a peaceable protest, it would not likely have created a negative backlash against the movement, but it also wouldn't likely have interrupted the normal transfer of power that was in effect. And so I think the reason the protest movement became a riot and became essentially an insurrection was because they felt they had no choice but to escalate to these violent methods to achieve their ends. But in practice, the entire apparatus of state-level electoral college kind of processes and court challenges and other sorts of attempts to interrupt, again, a free and fair process meant that there wasn't a nonviolent means to change this either. The nonviolent means was the court cases, was the challenges to election officials who did second counts and third counts, and so the process, the legal processes, the formal, the peaceful processes were used, and this group lost, and they refused to accept that, in fact, that it was, by a broad array of, in many cases, Republican officials found to be free and fair.
Now, there's been a lot of discussion in regards to how the Capitol Hill rioters were treated in comparison to Black Lives Matter protests in the DC area. Leaders have spoken out, former presidents. Now, based off of your research, whenever we compare protests from minorities and marginalized groups versus majority groups, historically, is there a difference?
Research suggests that there are at least two really important differences at play. So one is that when there are protests critical of the police, right? So elevating issues of like state violence, police tend, by some estimates, respond more aggressively, respond with more repression, about twice as much, right? So there's an ideological dimension, which is a movement which is trying to focus attention on some of the problems in policing in America. Police as much as they're trying to be, some sort of neutral arbiter, they seem to take that criticism personally and respond with more force to those protests. The second thing, which you touched on, is that race seems to play a role. And what we see is that when there are movements that have a significant number of African Americans, the recent Black Lives Matter protests were quite multiracial, but even when there's a significant degree of Black presence, that also seems to produce a more forceful police response. And so the differential we saw in this last, on the January 6th protest does seem to reflect both the ideological difference, right? This was not a movement being critical of policing, and the racial difference. This was an overwhelmingly white group, and so they're not, there isn't a part of the way to make sense of this is that there really are hundreds of years of stereotyping of African Americans as hyper violent and an incredible threat, and so in response to that kind of mythology, we see a lot of police are over respond, and as compared to, in this case, armed white vigilantes are perceived as safe. And so you saw a much more gentle response, people taking selfies, cops taking selfies with some of these rioters. And so there's evidence of, what research suggests we see across a large number of protests was reflected in this particular event as well.
So we're just a few days away from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Day. Can you talk to me a little bit about your research on the 1960s protests?
Yeah, so one of the things I look at in particular in the 1960s is just how did the civil rights movement achieve the major milestones it did in the mid-1960s. So there's a period where the civil rights movement is, it's a David against Goliath story. And by 1964, we have passage of the Civil Rights Act. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act. And so I was really curious, how was it that the civil rights movement was so effective? And what I found is that in the early part of the 1960s, not only were, we sort of have a story in our heads about how peaceful protest can be effective, and that's certainly true. But there actually was a lot of violence in these protests, but it was violence by segregationist police chiefs and vigilantes against protesters, right? So there are these classic images of young people being hit with fire hoses, or a young man being attacked by a dog. Those images of state violence against protesters were very powerful images and helped move public opinion in favor of making change, making progress on civil rights. And so what was striking to me was it's not that violence was, that these were peaceful protests. Violence was very central to the strategy of the civil rights movement, but it was making themselves the targets of violence. And by making themselves the targets of state violence, they were able to, essentially elevate images of how brutal Jim Crow was in the United States and around the world, and that really changed the dynamics for producing civil rights legislation. In the later part of the 1960s, coming to your question about Martin Luther King, what we observe is an increase in the degree to which protesters used more militant tactics. So there's more protester-initiated violence in the later part of the 1960s, and they are in part responding to some of the repression in the earlier part. So there's this more aggressive response to the white supremacist kind of repression that had happened in the earlier part of the 1960s. But what we see in that later part of the 1960s is that as the protesters use more violent tactics, public opinion shifts. And it's important to remember the country is 90% white at that time. So public opinion is really defined by what white America is thinking, and what we see is that public opinion shifts to being more in favor of law and order, tough on crime, and so while we might say, using violence in self-defense is legitimate, or that sort of an eye for an eye is a moral framework, in practice, using violent tactics in protests contributed to a shift in public opinion away from support for civil rights. And so that is the kind of the main finding of my results, is that while there are these legitimate injustices that people are up in arms about, to trying to right that wrong through protest, I find that the civil disobedience, particularly the civil disobedience where people were targets of the state, was the most effective method.
Now, as we all continue to move forward, we have an incoming administration. The presidential inauguration is just a few days away, but a lot of people still want their voice to be heard. So what advice can you give to those who want to successfully and peacefully influence politics?
Whether you're on the right or the left, what we see is that violence is, particularly when there's media coverage of that violence by protesters, it tends to move the conversation towards away from the underlying injustice and towards a focus on the behavior of the protesters, right? And so in some ways, it moves the story from an injustice story to a crime story, and in the news. And a lot of how the larger world is observing that protest is through the media. And so the kind of key insight from these activists over decades, and not just civil rights activists, but AIDS activists, disability rights activists, is, as one person put it, you don't, if you're a protester or you're part of a social movement, you don't talk to the media, you talk through the media. That there's a large audience of people observing what you're trying to say, and that it's really important to kind of focus the lens of the media on that, on your concern. And so part of where the January 6th insurrection went off the rails as a social movement, I mean, they were doing what they intended, which is to storm the Capitol, but they couldn't see how the larger world would perceive them. And in that way, were sort of in some ways too much in their own bubble. And so I think it requires, for a social movement to be effective, it has to at some level be able to have a certain kind of perspective taking of how might people outside of our movement, we're the true believers in this movement, how might people outside of the true believers perceive what we're doing? And that's very hard, because oftentimes people are, whether it's Black Lives Matter or these a far right group, that they have such deep conviction about their cause that it's very hard to do the perspective taking that says, okay, well, how is this going to play for much of America? And of course, if there has been an injustice, at some level, it's vital to articulate your anger. It's vital to express your dissatisfaction with the status quo. And so it's not that people should always be thinking of their social movement through the eyes of others, but effective social movements tend to think about, how do we grow a coalition? How do we build a winning majority for our cause? And what we saw in the insurrection was a different kind of tactic. It's how can we use coercion, how can we use violence rather than persuasion to advance our agenda.
Omar Wasow, assistant professor of politics at Princeton University. A lot of great insight. Thank you so much for joining us on News Now from Fox.
Thank you so much for having me, Rain.